The night Miravesh spent her last copper on a loaf of black bread in the iron market of Thornhold, 3 lives were already braided to hers by a thread none of them could yet see, and one of those lives had not even drawn breath. The wind off the hollow plains came in mean that evening, tasting of coal smoke and old blood and the bitter mineral tang of orine, that pale silver-yellow metal that traders called mercy and wolves called the slow death. It clung to the back of her tongue and made the pup inside her shift, restless, as though even unborn it knew that this place was sown with poison. She walked with one hand braced low under the curve of her belly, the other fisted in the moth-eaten wool of her cloak, and she kept her head down, because half-bloods who lifted their faces in Thornhold were half-bloods who got their teeth kicked in by Ashfell guards on principle. What she did not know, what no one in that square knew, was that by sundown, she would have outbid a king's ransom with a dead man's coin, that she would walk out of the market with a change ruler at her elbow and a silver-furred cub against her chest, and that the small life turning inside her carried the very gene the auctioneer's masters had spent 10 years and 100 raids trying to scrub from the bloodlines of the North. The square smelled of rust and rendered fat and the ozone bite of fresh-forged collars. Vendors hawked orine shavings by the thimble, orine wire by the spool, orine pins for the squeamish noble who wanted to keep a pleasure slave docile without leaving a mark. At the high end of the market, on a black stone dais lit by torches that hissed in the damp, the Ashfell Crown's auctioneer was warming his throat for the night's headline lot. Mira meant to walk past. She meant to buy her bread and turn south toward the broken old way station where she squatted, light a fire that would not draw eyes, and sleep with her hand on her belly, the way she had every night since the boundary raid. She meant to do nothing, see nothing, want nothing. Wanting was for women whose mates still breathed. Then she heard the cub. It was a thin, dry whimper, more breath than sound, the kind of noise a young animal makes when it has cried itself past crying and is only making the shape of grief from habit. Her wolf, what little wolf she had, weak and quarter-blood and shy, went very still inside her ribs and then strained forward as if pulled by a hook. She turned before she decided to turn. Through the press of cloaks and pike staffs, she saw the dais, and on the dais, she saw the man. He was on his knees, which was how the Ashfell preferred their prizes, but he was not bowed. His shoulders were too broad for the iron yoke they had set across them, and his head was up, and his eyes, gods, his eyes were the color of a winter river under cloud, gray going to silver at the edges, and they were fixed on nothing, because to fix them on the crowd would have been to grant the crowd the dignity of being seen. A collar of pale hammered orine sat snug at his throat, thick as 2 fingers, etched with the cramped little runes that locked the wolf inside the man. His wrists were bound the same way, in cuffs joined by a short chain of the same hateful metal. He had been a king once. He was still built like one, long legs folded under him, scarred forearms corded, a jaw cut hard enough to strike flint against. But none of that, none of the ruin of his royalty, was what made the breath stutter out of Mira's chest. What stopped her was the bundle in his arms. He was holding a wolf cub. A small one, no bigger than a loaf of that black bread she would never get to buy, with fur the soft, uncertain silver of moonlight on Riverstone. Its eyes were squeezed shut. Its nose was tucked beneath the hinge of the man's jaw, in the one warm hollow the collar had not stolen from him. He was holding it, the way Mira had seen mothers in her old village hold babies who had stopped breathing. Not tightly, but with the whole of his attention, as though if he forgot for a single heartbeat, the child would slip out of the world entirely. The auctioneer was already shouting. "Rowan Drovic," he was crying, "last of the Drovic line, dethroned Alpha King of the North, broken to harness, warranted docile under Aurene, with—" And here the man's voice took on the oily lilt of a joke he expected the crowd to enjoy. "With one extra runt thrown in for the buyer's amusement." Mira's mouth filled with the taste of iron. The cub made that thin, dry sound again, and the dethroned king turned his head a fraction, just enough to brush his cheek along the soft silver fur. And Mira understood three things at once. The cub had locked into his shape. He could not change back, and the moment any buyer pried him out of those scarred arms, the Ashfell guards would put a bolt through the small silver skull as a kindness. Because a wolf cub that could not be a boy was no use to anyone but the king who loved him. She did not remember walking forward. She remembered the crowd parting because pregnant women in Thornhold were given a half-step's grudging room. And she remembered the cold of the dais stone striking up through the thin soles of her boots. And she remembered the auctioneer pausing mid-sentence to look down at her, with the particular contempt that high-born middlemen reserve for women who smelled of wood smoke and herbs. He had a soft, plump face, this auctioneer, and a velvet collar trimmed in marten fur, and a gold pin shaped like an Ashfell hawk gripping a wolf in its talons. His name, she would learn later, was Brigham of House Velt, but in this moment he was only a mouth and a sneer and the long, pale finger he raised to wave her off. "The bidding," he said, smiling at the noble box at the back of the square, "is restricted to chartered houses, little mother. Step down before someone steps on you." Mira's pulse was doing something strange. It was not racing. It was settling, the way a horse settles when it has finally seen the fence it means to clear. She lifted her chin, and she looked past Brigham at the kneeling man. And the kneeling man, slowly, because everything about him was slow under the weight of the metal, lifted his eyes from the cub and met hers. The river under cloud, the silver at the edges. He did not plead. He did not even hope. He only looked at her, exhausted and steady, and she felt something in her chest do a thing it had not done since the night Cason, her mate, had walked out of their hut with a torch in his hand and not come back. She felt the thread. Not bright, not strong, just the merest hum, like a struck wire still ringing 2 rooms away. Impossible. Half-bloods did not feel threads. Widows did not feel threads. Pregnant women carrying another man's pup did not feel threads. And yet, the pup inside her shifted again, and this time it was not restless. It was attentive, as if it too had heard the wire. "I bid," Mira said, and her voice came out so much steadier than she expected that it surprised her. Brigham laughed. It was a polite, bored laugh, the laugh of a man humoring a beggar. "With what, little mother?" he said. "Your blessings? Your weeds?" Mira reached into the inner pocket of her cloak. The thing she drew out was small and old and warm from her body, a disc of dark wood the size of a child's palm, banded in tarnished silver, carved on its face with the running wolf sigil of the Hollowmere pack. On its reverse, in script so fine you had to tilt it to the firelight to read, were the words that every wolf, highborn or low, knew by heart. Paid in full, by widow's right, sacred and unbarterable. It was Cason's bond dowry. It was the price his line had paid for her hand, the only thing the Hollowmere elders had not been able to strip from her when they cast her out. Because to strip a widow of her dowry was to invite the old gods to strip the pack of its luck. She held it up between 2 fingers, and the torchlight caught the silver band, and across the square a hush moved like wind through wheat. "I bid the widow's dowry of Cason of Hollowmere," she said, loud enough now to carry, "on the prisoner Rowan Drovick, and on the cub in his arms, both, together, undivided, by sacred law." Brigham's smile did not so much fall as curdle. He knew the law. Every auctioneer in Thornhold knew the law. A widow's dowry, offered openly in market, could not be outbid by any highborn house, because to do so was to spit on the dead, and the dead in the north were patient and had long memories. He could refuse the bid only by declaring the lot unfit for sacred coin, and to do that, he would have to publicly admit that the Ashfell crown was selling something it had no clean right to sell. He looked, for one panicked breath, toward the noble box. Mira followed his glance. In the box stood a tall woman in pearl gray silk, her dark hair coiled high, her face long and clever, and so still it might have been carved. Her eyes met Brigham's, and after a moment, almost imperceptibly, she inclined her head. "Take it," the jester said. "We will collect later." Brigham turned back to Mira. "Sold," he said, through teeth that did not want to part. "To the widow. May her dead rest easy." He spat the last word. Mira climbed the dais. Up close the king smelled of sweat and iron and, faintly, of pine resin under all of it, and the cub in his arms smelled of milk and fear. She knelt, awkwardly because of the belly, and laid the dowry disc on the black stone between them. The Orient cuffs at his wrists rattled once as he adjusted the cub against his chest. He did not speak. He only looked at her, that steady, exhausted look, and then, very softly, in a voice rough from disuse and rougher from grief, he said one word. "Why?" Mira found she did not have a clean answer. She had a belly full of a pup the healers said would die. She had a hut full of dried yarrow and no coin for winter. She had no business buying a fallen king and a doomed child. She thought of the wire still humming faintly under her ribs, and she thought of the way he had tucked his cheek against the cub's fur, and she said the only true thing she could find. Because no one else was going to. The walk out of Thornhold took longer than the walk in, because a chained man cannot move quickly, and a pregnant woman with a wolf cub bundled inside her cloak cannot move at all without stopping every quarter mile to breathe. Brigham's clerks had unhooked the king from the dais ring, but left the collar and cuffs on, and they had handed Mira the key with the kind of flourish that suggested they expected her to lose it before sunrise. She had tucked it down the front of her dress, between her breasts, where no cut purse in the alleys would dare to fish for it without losing fingers. The cub she had taken from Rowan only after he had let it go himself, slowly, with the careful, unwilling tenderness of a man surrendering the last warm thing in his world. The little wolf had whined once when it left his arms, then pressed its damp black nose into the wool over Mira's heart, and gone abruptly, exhaustedly, asleep. The king walked behind her. He did not try to run. He did not try to speak. Twice she felt him stumble, and twice she heard him catch himself before she had to turn. The Oreen in his collar was doing what Oreen did to his kind, making every step feel like wading in cold mud, making every breath taste of foil. By the time they cleared the last of the city's iron gates and the road bent down into the bracken country south of Thornhold, his face under the moonlight was the color of bone. Mira stopped at the first standing stone past the gate, the old waymarker carved with a worn-down running wolf, and she turned to look at him. Up close, in clean light, without the shame of the dais on him, he was younger than she had thought. Not young. There was gray at his temples and a long, pale scar that ran from the hinge of his jaw down into the open neck of his ruined shirt. But younger than the king of the north in the songs, who was a giant 50 winters old and could break a bear's spine with one hand. This man was perhaps 35. He was tall enough that even kneeling on the dais, he had been at her eye level. His shoulders, freed of the yoke, were beginning to remember what shoulders were for. "Sit," she said. He looked at her. "Sit," she said again, more gently, "before you fall and break something I can't fix." He sat. It was not graceful. The cuffs forced his hands together in front of him, and he had to lower himself by stages, hip to stone, then back to stone, then head tipped against the carved wolf. The cub stirred inside her cloak, and she eased it out and laid it in the curve of his arm without asking. The change in him was immediate. Some line in his shoulders went out of him, and his cheek dropped to the silver fur, and he closed his eyes, and Mira thought, "Oh, you fool. You stupid, soft-hearted woman. You have brought home something that will break you." She knelt, slow, with the help of the stone, and drew the key from her dress. "The cuffs first," she said. "The collar I want to look at by daylight, in case the runes are barbed. Do you have a name?" He opened his eyes. They were silver gray and wary in a way that was not for her. "Rowan," he said. "Drovic." "I know your title," she said. "I asked your name." A pause, then quieter, as if it surprised him to be asked. "Rowan is enough." "The cub," she said. "The cub is Tammy," he said. "My sister's son. He is 4. He has not spoken since the night they came." Mira's hand stilled on the cufflock. 4. The cub in his arms was the size of a half-grown house cat. Wolf cubs of 4 winters should have been the size of a yearling deer, ganglion, strong, already shifting back and forth for fun. This one was a runt, locked in the wrong shape by terror, and he was shrinking, the way starved things shrink. She turned the key. The cuffs sprang open with a sigh. Rowan flexed his fingers, as though he had forgotten they belonged to him. "Thank you," he said. He did not say it like a king. He said it like a man. They reached the way station just before the moon set. Mira's home was a half-collapsed road shrine of the sort the old North-South traders had built before the wars. 3 stone walls and a sagging roof of slate. A hearth in the corner that smoked badly when the wind came from the east. A single shutterless window that she had stuffed with sheep's wool against the cold. There were dried herbs in bunches from the rafters. There was a straw pallet in one corner with a folded quilt that had been Kaysen's mother's. There was a clay pot of yarrow tea cold on the hearthstone. It was not a den. It was barely a room, but the door closed, and the door barred, and in the corner under a loose flagstone, she had a knife and 3 silver coins, and her grandmother's hagstone that the village had let her keep because no one else dared touch it. She lit the fire. She set water to boil. She cut bread, the last of yesterday's, because she had spent her bread money on the bid, and the irony of that was not lost on her. And she sliced the hard end of a yellow cheese and laid it on the hearthstone to soften. Rowan sat on the floor by the fire because he did not trust the rickety stool, and he held the cub on his thigh, and he watched her move with the steady measuring quiet of a man cataloging every exit. "Eat," she said, and pushed the bread and cheese toward him. He looked at the food, then at her. "You first," he said. "I'm pregnant," she said dryly. "I have eaten 3 times today already. Eat." The corner of his mouth, the unscarred corner, moved a fraction. It was not a smile. It was the memory of where a smile used to live. He ate, slowly at first, then less slowly. And when she set a clay cup of warm yarrow tea by his hand, he drank that too. And some color came back into his face. The cub would not eat bread. She broke off a corner anyway and tucked it under his nose, and he turned his head away. She tried a strip of dried venison from the bundle in the rafters. and his nostrils flared, but he did not take it. She thought for a moment, then went to her stores and brought down the small clay jar she had been hoarding for her own confinement. Goat's milk, fresh that morning from the widow Pell's nanny 3 miles up the road, traded for a poultice. She warmed a finger's worth in a tin cup over the fire and held it to the cub's mouth. The little black nose twitched. The pink tongue came out. He drank. Rowan made a sound. It was not a word. It was the sound a man makes when something he has been bracing against for a long time finally gives way, and he had to drop his face into the silver fur to hide it. Mira pretended not to see. She set the cup down within reach and went to bank the fire. And behind her she heard him whisper, just once, into the cub's ear, "Hold on, Tammy. Hold on. The woman has milk for you. Hold on." She gave him the pallet. He refused it. They argued about this in the low, courteous voices of two people who were each, secretly, more tired than they had been in years. And in the end, she won by the simple expedient of lying down on it herself and pulling the quilt up to her chin and closing her eyes. He could sleep on the floor by the hearth, she said. Or he could sleep standing up against the wall like a horse. But she was carrying a child, and she was going to sleep on the straw. He made a low, rough sound that she chose to interpret as agreement. And after a while, she heard him settle by the fire, with the cub curled against his ribs. She did not sleep at first. She lay listening to the fire breathe and to his breathing, and to the small, whuffing snore of the cub. And she thought, there is a man in my house. There has not been a man in my house since the night they brought Kaysen home on a board. There is a king in my house. There is a child in my house. There is a hum, faint as a struck wire 2 rooms away, and it will not stop. She put her hand on her belly. The pup turned, slow and lazy, and pressed what felt like a small foot against her palm. Hush, she told it, and it hushed, and at last she slept. She woke before dawn to a sound she did not at first recognize. It was a low, rhythmic murmur, half words and half breath. And for a confused half-second, she thought it was Kaysen, that she had dreamed the last 1.5 years, and Kaysen was sitting up in the dark, singing to their child the way he had promised he would. Then she remembered. She turned her head on the straw. Rowan was sitting cross-legged by the embers, his back against the hearthstone, the cub Tammy stretched across his thighs. He was speaking, very low, in a tongue she did not know, the old North tongue, she realized, the wolf tongue, the one the Ashfell Crown had outlawed 40 years ago. The words rolled out of him in a soft, uneven cadence, and Tammy's small silver ears twitched at every other syllable. And Mira understood after a moment that Rowan was telling the cub a story about a wolf prince who got lost in a snowstorm and was found by a stranger who shared her fire. He stopped when he realized she was awake. The flow of old words snapped off, and he looked at her over the cub's head, and in the red light of the embers, the hard, exhausted lines of his face were softer than she had any right to see. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't," she said. It was a lie that they both let stand. She sat up, slow, with the awkward rolling pivot the belly required, and pulled the quilt around her shoulders, and she came to sit on the other side of the hearth. They did not speak for a long moment. The cub snuffled in his sleep, and Rowan adjusted him absently, his big scarred hand splayed across the silver flank with a tenderness that did not match the rest of him. Mira watched that hand and thought, this is the hand the songs say tore an Ashfell general's throat out at the Battle of Scar Pass. This is the hand, and it is petting a sleeping cub. He saw her looking. He did not move the hand. Ask, he said. Ask what? She said. Whatever you are not asking, he said. You bought me. You owed the answers. I didn't buy you, she said. I bought your freedom from being bought. There is a difference. He looked at her then in a way that made the wire under her ribs hum a little louder, and she had to drop her eyes. Tell me then, she said, looking at the fire. What happened? To you? To him? The whole of it? He told her. He told her in the same low, even voice he had used for the cub, and he did not flinch from any of it. The fall of the Northern Court at the hands of the Ashfell expansion. The poisoning of his elder brother, Tammy's father, by something slow and unmistakably Orine-laced in his wine. The court physicians who had sworn the death was natural and who had vanished one by one in the months that followed. The night the Southern Legion had come over the wall, guided. This was the part where his voice flattened, the way a blade flattens when struck too hard. Guided by someone on the inside. Someone who knew which gate would be undefended, which corridor the royal nursery lay along, which servants could be bribed, and which had to be killed. He had gotten Tammy out. He had gotten no one else. His sister had died putting the cub in his arms. Tammy had shifted that night for the first time, 2 years early, dragged across the line by terror, and he had not shifted back since. They had fled north and east and been caught at the iron fords, and the Ashfell Crown had decided not to kill the last Drovik, but to sell him, because a dead king was a martyr, and a sold king was a joke. The auction had been timed for the night of the new moon, when the wolf in him would be at its weakest, and the Orine bite would feel cleanest. Mira listened with her hands folded over her belly. When he was done, she did not say, I'm sorry, because sorry was a word that did nothing. She said, the one on the inside, do you know who? Rowan's jaw worked once. I have a guess, he said. I cannot prove it. There was a woman, on my brother's council. She had been there since I was a boy. She had a way of being in every room before anyone else arrived. She wore pearl gray, always. Her name... He paused, because the cub had stirred. Her name, he said more quietly, was Lady Saren Vrail. Mira felt the cold of the hearthstone go up through her hip. Saren Vrail. She had heard that name. Not in court. She had never been near a court. But in the survivors' whispers after the boundary raid that had taken Kaysen. The raid had not been Ashfell. It had been wearing Ashfell colors, but the orders had come from somewhere quieter, and the only name the dying lieutenant had been able to give before he choked out his last was a woman's name, a council name, a Vrail name. Mira's mouth went dry. The pearl gray woman from the noble box. Tonight. Rowan was watching her face. What? He said. She told him. He listened the way she had listened, without moving, without interrupting. When she was done, he looked down at the cub on his thigh for a long moment, and then he looked up at her, and the thing in his eyes was not surprise. It was the slow, grim recognition of a pattern, finally seen whole. Then she has been hunting both of us, he said, for a long time. And she does not know yet, Mira said, that we have come into the same room. No, he said, she does not. The fire cracked. Outside, somewhere in the bracken, a small night thing screamed and was silenced. Mira put her palm flat against her belly. The pup pressed back, warm and certain. Whatever you are, she thought down at it, fiercely. Whatever you are that they want, they will not have you. They will not have any of us. Across the hearth, Rowan was watching her hand on her belly with an expression she could not read, and the wire under her ribs hummed and hummed and hummed. 3 weeks went by. The way station, which had been only a roof for one, learned how to be a den for 4. Mira, Rowan, Tammy, and the unborn pup that Mira had begun, despite herself, to talk to in the quiet hours. Rowan did the work that her belly was making impossible. He hauled water from the stream a 1/4 mile down the slope. He split the rotted shutter into kindling and built her a new one from a cedar plank he found in the collapsed half of the building. He climbed onto the slate roof and laid stones over the worst leaks. He did all of this with the Aurine collar still around his neck. The runes on it were barbed, as Mira had feared. Try to lift the collar over his head, and they would tear his throat from the inside. But she had found, by working with a borrowed file and 3 nights of patient scraping, that she could thin the metal at the back enough that the worst of the suppression eased. Not enough to let his wolf rise, enough to let him sleep without nightmares, enough to bring some of the color back into his face. He thanked her for it the way he thanked her for everything, with a small, grave nod and an unspoken promise behind the eyes. Tammy began to drink milk during the day as well as at night. He still did not shift. He still did not speak. But on the 8th day, he climbed, on his own, into Mira's lap while she was sitting by the door grinding dried elder bark, and he laid his small silver head across the curve of her belly, and he stayed there for an hour, breathing in time with the pup inside her. Mira looked up to see Rowan standing in the doorway with an armload of split wood and a look on his face that she had to glance away from, because if she did not glance away, she was going to do something foolish. From that day on, the cub slept curled against her belly as often as he slept curled against Rowan's chest, and the pup inside her stopped its restless turning whenever the silver fur was near, and the wire under her ribs did not so much hum now as sing, low and constant, like a kettle just beginning to boil. It was on the 10th day that Bray came. Bray, Braden of Hollowmere, second son of the old Beta, Mira's milk brother and the only one of her pack who had broken exile law to follow her south, was a long, freckled, perpetually rumpled young man with hair the color of wet straw and a grin that he wielded the way other men wielded knives. He had been bringing her supplies once a month since her exile, slipping out under the excuse of border patrol, and he was not due for another fortnight. When he came up the path in the early afternoon, his bay mare lathered and his grin missing, Mira knew before he opened his mouth that something was wrong. She met him at the door. He looked past her into the room, where Rowan was on one knee, mending the leg of the rickety stool, and Tammy was watching from the hearth, with the bright, wary eyes of a creature ready to flee. Bray's hand went to the long knife at his hip. Mira stepped between him and the door. "Bray," she said. "He's mine." Bray's eyes came back to her face. "Mira," he said carefully. "That is the dethroned Alpha King of the North. There are bounty notices on every post from here to the Iron Fords. 3 Ashfell scout companies on the road as we speak, and one of them is under a Vrail banner. They are not looking for him. They are looking for the pregnant woman who bought him." Mira's stomach went cold. She kept her face very still. "How long?" she said. 2 days, Bray said. 3 at the outside. The Vrail company is moving slowly because they have a tracker with them, a real one, not a hound, a man. Rowan, behind her, had risen to his feet without sound. She felt rather than saw him come to stand at her shoulder. Bray's eyes flicked up to him. Bray was tall, but Rowan was taller, and after a long second, Bray let out a breath and took his hand off the knife. "Your Grace," he said, which surprised Mira. She had not thought Bray knew the form. Rowan inclined his head. "I am no one's grace," he said in that low, rough voice. "But I thank you for the warning. Why bring it?" Bray looked at Mira. Because she's mine, he said simply, the way you said you were hers. Mira's throat closed for a second. She had not known until that moment how much she had needed someone from her old life to walk through the door and not flinch. She reached out and gripped Bray's wrist hard enough to hurt. "Stay the night," she said. "Eat. Tell me everything. Then we'll plan." They sat around the hearth that evening, the four of them and the cub, and Bray talked. He talked about the Vrail Company and its tracker, a half-Ashfell named Corin who could read a footprint in running water. He talked about the broader pattern, the raids on half-blood enclaves all along the old northern border. Raids that were always blamed on rival packs, but always, when you looked at the survivors, took the same kind of victim. Pregnant women, young mothers, girls of childbearing age from the old bloodlines. He did not know, he said, what they were looking for. But they were looking. Mira and Rowan looked at each other across the fire. Neither said it aloud. Bray left at dawn the next day, with a promise to ride hard for the Hollowmere elders and to argue, on his life, for sanctuary. Mira did not let herself believe the elders would say yes. The elders had cast her out. The elders would not unbend for one widow and one disgraced king and one runt cub, no matter how prettily Bray argued. But Bray was riding, and that was something. 2 days, 3 at the outside. She and Rowan spent the first of those days preparing the way station as well as they could. He moved the woodpile to bar the broken half of the wall. She mixed 3 batches of the strongest sleep poultice she knew, the kind that would knock a wolf flat for an hour if pressed to the nose. They cleared the stream path of brush so that no one could ambush from it. They did not speak much, because there was a thing growing between them that wanted speaking, and that neither of them, with 2 days left, could afford to speak. On the second night, the thing nearly got loose. She had been kneeling by the fire to bank it for the night. The cub was already asleep on the pallet, curled in the hollow of the quilt. Rowan came up behind her with a folded shawl, her own, that she had left by the door, and instead of handing it to her, he laid it carefully around her shoulders, and his hand stayed there, on the curve where neck became shoulder, just for a heartbeat too long. She turned her head. He was very close. The fire was low, and the light on him was the soft red of embers, and the silver scar along his jaw caught it, and his eyes. Gods, his eyes were doing the river under cloud thing again, only the cloud had thinned. "Mira," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. He said it like a man who had been carrying it carefully in his mouth for days, afraid to drop it. She felt the wire under her ribs tighten until it sang. She let the shawl fall a little, off one shoulder. She lifted her face. He bent. They did not quite meet. The latch on the door rattled. Both of them froze. The latch rattled again, and then there was a small thump, and then silence. Rowan was already moving. He set Mira behind him with one hand and crossed to the door in 3 long strides and lifted the bar and opened it a careful hand's width. On the threshold sat a fox kit, half-grown, mangy, one ear chewed, with a dead vole held proudly in its jaws, and the bright, wet eyes of a creature offering tribute. It dropped the vole at Rowan's bare foot. It looked up. It chirruped. Then it turned and trotted, with great dignity, back into the bracken. Rowan stood very still for a long moment. Then his shoulders began to shake. Mira, half laughing, half furious at the interruption, came to stand beside him in the doorway and looked down at the vole. "A gift," she said, "from the wood." "From the wood," he agreed. His shoulders were still shaking. She realized after a moment that he was not laughing. He was, very quietly, weeping. She did not ask him why. She thought she knew. A king who had lost a kingdom, a brother, a sister, a court, was being given a vole on his doorstep by a half-grown fox, because the small, wild things of the wood had decided he belonged here. She slid her hand into his fingers closed around hers, hard enough to bruise, and they stood like that in the doorway for a long time. And the almost kiss was not finished, and the wire sang on. The Vrail Company came on the morning of the third day, an hour before noon, 11 horses on the ridge above the way station, and the pearl-gray banner snapping crisp in a wind that smelled of coming rain. Mira saw them first. She had gone out to the woodpile and she had looked up by accident, and there they were on the skyline, 11 dark shapes and the pale flag, and the breath went out of her so completely that for a full count of 3, she could not call out. Then she did. "Rowan," she said, low and sharp, and he was at the door before the second syllable. He looked at the ridge. He looked at her. He said one word. "Inside." And she went. Tammy was already on the pallet, ears flat. Rowan barred the door behind her and crossed to the hearth, and reached up into the rafters where, over the last week, he had quietly tied a length of cedar wood the length of his forearm into the thatch. He pulled it down. It was not a sword. It was barely a club. But it was hardwood and balanced, and his hand fit it as if it had been carved for him. And watching him weigh it, Mira understood for the first time that she was looking at a man who had killed people, many people, and would do so again now, without hesitation. The collar at his throat caught the firelight. The orine still bound his wolf inside him. He would have to do this as a man. "Open the door," he said quietly. "Let them think they are talking to a frightened pregnant woman alone. I will be behind it." Mira nodded. She took 3 slow breaths. She unbarred the door. She pulled her shawl up over her hair and her belly, and she opened it, and she stepped out onto the worn flagstone with her hands open and visible. The riders were already at the foot of the slope. At their head was a tall, narrow man in pearl-gray livery, not Saren herself then, but one of her captains. And beside him, on a smaller dun horse, was a wiry man in nondescript leathers with eyes the color of pond ice. The tracker. Corin. Behind them, 8 soldiers, and at the back, riding without escort, a single rider in a dark cloak whose hood was up. The captain raised a gloved hand. "Halt and be seen," he called. "By order of House Vrail and the Ashfell Crown." Mira inclined her head. She did not speak. Let them come closer. Let them think her cowed. They came. The captain swung down at the edge of her bare yard. Corin stayed mounted, but his pale eyes moved over the way station, over the door, over the smoke from the chimney, over Mira herself, and she felt them touch her belly and stop there, for a fraction too long. The captain produced a scroll. "You are Mira of Hollowmere," he said, "formerly of that pack, exiled by the Elder's decree, currently squatting on contested land in violation of 3 statutes." Mira said nothing. "You are also," he said, "in unlawful possession of crown property, to wit, the dethroned criminal Rowan Drovic, and 1 feral wolf creature unfit for civilized care." She tilted her head. "I bought him in open market," she said, "by widow's right, with sacred coin. The bid was witnessed and accepted by your own auctioneer. There is no unlawful possession." The captain's mouth thinned. "Widow's right," he said, "is under review. Pending that review, you will surrender the prisoner and the creature and accompany us back to Thornhold for questioning." Mira did not move. "I am 8 months gone with child," she said. "I will not travel." The cloaked rider at the back of the column moved. It was a small motion, the lift of a hand to push back the hood, But every horse in the column stilled, because every horse knew the gesture of its true master. Saren Vrail's face, in daylight, was less carved and more clever than it had looked across the auction square. Long, pale, fine-boned, with eyes the gray of slate after rain. She smiled at Mira. It was a kind smile. It was the most frightening thing Mira had ever seen. "Child," she said. Her voice was warm, melodious, motherly. "There has been a misunderstanding. Forgive my captain his bluntness. We have not come for the prisoner. We have come for you." Mira's hand moved without her permission to her belly. Saren's gaze followed it. Her smile widened a fraction. "You carry," she said, "a very rare thing. Did you know?" "I expect you did not." The Hollowmere line was thought extinct on the distaff side, but here you are, half-blood, and exiled, and so very pregnant, and the child in you is humming with a gift the world has not seen in 100 years. "We have been looking for you for a long time, Mira of Hollowmere. We did not know it was you specifically. We knew there was a woman of your line somewhere on the border, and we knew she would, eventually, conceive. So we watched. So we raided. So we removed any mate who might have anchored you to a pack that could protect you." Mira's vision went white at the edges. "Kaysen," she said. Saren's smile did not falter. "The young beta of Hollowmere," she said. "Kaysen, yes. He fought well. He took 2 of mine with him before they brought him down." Behind the door, Mira heard the smallest sound, the shift of weight, a cedar club settling in a tightening grip. She prayed fiercely for Rowan to wait. Saren had not yet mentioned the king. Saren did not yet know. "Come with us willingly," Saren said, "and we will deliver your child safely. We will even, as a kindness, not call the runt cub or the chained dog inside that house. You may keep them as pets, if it pleases you, in the comfortable rooms we will provide. Refuse, and we will take you anyway. And the child will be taken from you the moment it is born, and the cub and the dog will be skinned for collar trim before your eyes. The choice is yours. I am, as you see, being generous." Mira looked at the captain. She looked at the 8 soldiers. She looked at Corin the tracker, whose pale eyes had not left her. She looked, finally, at Saren Vrail. She thought of Kaysen going out into the dark with a torch in his hand. She thought of Tammy on her belly, breathing in time with the pup. She thought of Rowan in the doorway, holding her hand while a fox kit gave him a vole. The wire under her ribs was no longer humming. It was a hot, taut line of light. She smiled. It surprised her to find she could. "I refuse," she said. Saren sighed, the disappointed sigh of a tutor with a slow pupil. "Take her," she said. The captain stepped forward. The door of the way station slammed open. Rowan came out of it moving faster than a man in an Aurine collar had any right to move, and the Cedar Club took the captain across the temple before the captain had finished drawing his sword. The captain dropped. The horses screamed. One of the soldiers loosed a crossbow bolt that took Rowan in the thigh, and he did not so much as grunt. He yanked it free in stride and used the bloody point to put out the throat of the next soldier who came within reach. 2 more soldiers were on him. Corin was already off his horse and circling toward Mira with a long, thin knife held low. Mira backed against the door. Her hands were on her belly. She had no weapon. She had no wolf. She had only the singing wire and the pup turning hard inside her, and the absolute certainty that she would not let this woman or this man or any of these men have what they had come for. Corin lunged. The world, quite simply, went silver. There was no sound. There was no flash. There was only the sudden understanding, in every cell of Mira's body, that the light that had been gathering under her ribs for weeks was not a metaphor, and was not a hum, and was not a thread. It was a fire, and it was hers. It came out of her on a single sharp exhale, a sheet of pale silver flame that was not hot, that did not burn the door at her back, that did not even singe her shawl. It went outward in a clean, radiating wave, and it touched Corrin's blade, and the blade unmade itself in his hand into a fine silver dust. It touched the chests of the two soldiers on Rowan, and they staggered backward as if struck by a great soft hand, and went down gasping, alive but weeping, their eyes streaming, their hands held up as if to ward off a memory. It touched the orine collar at Rowan's throat, and the runes on it flared once, black, and then crumbled. The collar fell off him in two pieces and rang on the flagstone. It touched, last, the pearl-gray rider at the back of the column. Saren Vrail's horse reared. Saren herself did not flinch. Her clever long face had gone, for the first time, entirely still, and her slate eyes were fixed on Mira with a hunger so naked that Mira understood, finally and completely, what she was looking at. Saren was not afraid. Saren was delighted. "There you are," Saren breathed. Then Rowan, free of the collar, threw back his head, and the sound that came out of him was not a man's sound. It was the long, building, bone-deep howl of a wolf-king 10 years caged, and on the second note of it, the air around him broke, and the wolf came through. He was enormous. He was the color of wet slate going to silver at the muzzle, and his eyes, when they swung to Saren, were the same river under cloud as the man's. He did not waste breath on a snarl. He simply moved. Saren's horse bolted. The remaining soldiers, 3 of them still standing, broke and ran. Corrin, weaponless, turned and sprinted for the bracken. Rowan let him go. He went instead for Saren. Saren's horse threw her at the edge of the slope. She rolled and came up with a small dark object in her hand. A vial, glass, the contents of it bright and oily yellow. Orine, distilled. Liquid bond cutter. She flung it at Rowan's open mouth. The vial spun in the air. Mira, on the threshold, with the silver fire still pouring out of her in long, unraveling threads, lifted her hand. The threads caught the vial mid-arc. They wrapped it. They turned its trajectory in a slow, dreamlike curve back the way it had come, and the vial broke not on Rowan's tongue, but on Saren Vrail's upturned face. Saren had perhaps a second to understand. Her own poison, distilled to cut a true bond, going into her own eyes and mouth and throat. She did not scream. She made a small, soft, surprised sound, almost a laugh. And then she was on her knees, and then she was on the ground, and the pearl-gray silk was darkening around her collar, and her clever slate eyes were going the dull color of cooled lead. The silver fire in Mira guttered. Her knees went. She sat down hard on the flagstone with her back against the door, and the world tilted, and the last thing she saw before it went black was Rowan, the wolf, the king, her king, turning from the body of Saren Vrail and crossing the yard in 3 great bounds to lay his huge silver head very gently against her belly. She woke to lamplight and to the smell of yarrow and goat's milk, and to a small warm weight curled under her chin. Tammy, the cub, had wedged himself into the hollow of her throat and was breathing in long, slow puffs against her collarbone, and his ears twitched every time her pulse moved. Beyond the cub, sitting on the floor beside the pallet with his back against the bed frame, and one hand resting on the curve of her belly, was Rowan. He was a man again. He was wearing one of Bray's old shirts, which was too small across the shoulders. and the long, pale scar along his jaw was joined now by a fresh pink one across the meat of his thigh where the bolt had gone in and come out. The orange collar was gone. The cuffs were gone. He looked, despite the new wound and the bruise blooming along one cheekbone, like a man who had slept. When her eyes opened, he did not move his hand. He only looked at her, and he said, very softly, "You came back." "How long?" she said. Her own voice was a rasp. "2 days," he said. "The fire took everything you had. I was afraid." He stopped. He did not finish. He did not have to. "The pup," Mira said, with sudden sharp panic. "Is the pup—" "Alive," he said immediately. "Alive and turning. Listen." He took her hand and laid it over his on her belly, and after a moment, the small foot pressed up into both their palms, sturdy as a heartbeat. Mira closed her eyes. Tears slid out from under the lids. She felt Rowan's thumb very carefully rush one of them away. "Saren," she said. "Dead," he said. "Her own poison. The captain dead. 2 of the soldiers dead. The rest fled. The tracker fled. They will not come back, not alone. The Crown will hear, and the Crown will have to decide what to do, and that will take time. The pearl gray banner has fallen, Mira. We have time. We have time." She opened her eyes. He was very close. The cub between them was a small, warm anchor. The lamplight on his face turned the silver in his eyes to a softer thing. "I am sorry," she said. "For what?" he said. "For—" She did not have the words. "For bringing this down on us. For the fire. For—" He shook his head. "Mira," he said, "you did not bring this down. They brought it. You ended it." He paused, then quieter still. "And the fire is yours. It has been yours since before you were born. There is nothing in it to be sorry for." She thought, I should ask him how he knows. She thought, I should ask him how the wolf came back through Oreen, and how my fire did what it did, and whether the pup is what they said it was, and what we do now. She did not ask any of these things. Instead, she said, "Your leg." He almost smiled. The unscarred corner of his mouth lifted just a little. "My leg is fine," he said. "The wolf healed it when he came through. There will be a scar. I have a great many scars. One more is not a tragedy." Tammy stirred between them. He lifted his small silver head. He looked at Mira. He looked at Rowan, and in a voice rusty with 2 months of disuse, in a voice no one in the world had heard since the night his mother had died, putting him in his uncle's arms, he said, hungry. Both Mira and Rowan went absolutely still. "Tammy," Rowan said. The cub yawned. "Hungry," he said again, more crossly, and then, with great effort, as if remembering a more difficult word, "Please." Mira began to laugh, very softly, with tears still wet on her cheeks. Rowan made a sound in his throat that was not laughter and was not weeping, but was something better than either, and he scooped the cub up in one big hand and held him against his chest and pressed his mouth to the soft silver fur of the small skull and said, in a voice gone thick, "All right, little king. All right. Food, milk, anything you want, anything in the world." He looked at Mira over the cub's head. The river under cloud had broken open entirely. There was sun in his eyes. "Anything in the world," he said again, and Mira understood that he was no longer speaking to Tammy. She held out her hand. He took it. He brought it to his mouth, and he pressed his lips to her knuckles, slowly, deliberately. the way a man takes a vow. Then he stood, and he carried the cub to the hearth, and he warmed the milk himself. Mira lay watching him in the lamplight. The wire under her ribs was quiet now, not gone, settled, like a lamp turned low for the night, still burning, no longer needed to flare. She put her hand on her belly, and she said to the pup inside her, in the silent way she had learned to talk to it, "We are all right, little one. We are all right." The pup, who would later be born under a hunter's moon and named for both her father and her uncle, kicked once, agreeable, and went back to sleep. In the weeks that followed, the way station became, slowly and without anyone naming it, a den. Bray came back, with 3 other Hollowmere youngsters who had decided on their own to defy the elders, and they brought a wagon load of timber and a goat in milk and the tentative, half-shamed message that the elders themselves were beginning to argue. News traveled. The pearl-gray banner had fallen on contested land, in a yard belonging to an exiled half-blood widow, and the dethroned Alpha King of the North had been seen there in his wolf shape, free and whole. The story moved north and east faster than any rider. By the time the first frost hardened the bracken, 6 scattered remnants of the old Druvik vassal villages had sent quiet emissaries asking, in careful, neutral phrases, whether their king might be persuaded to come home. Rowan listened to each of them. He thanked each of them. He told each of them the same thing. Not yet. He had a child to raise and a woman to court, and a pup not yet born to meet. And the kingdom of the North had survived without him for 10 years, and could survive a little longer. The emissaries went away looking to a man, both disappointed and oddly comforted. Mira, listening from the corner where she sat grinding herbs with Tammy curled on her foot, thought, "He is going to be a different king than he was." She thought, "The kingdom is lucky." The pup came in the 2nd week of the hunter's moon. The labor was long, and Mira swore at length, in 3 languages, mostly at Rowan, who took it very well and did not let go of her hand once. Bray's eldest sister, a midwife of great competence and greater patience, caught the child. It was a girl. She had a thatch of black hair like her mother's, and slate-gray eyes like her father had had, and, when the midwife laid her on Mira's chest, she opened her tiny mouth and let out a single, pure, ringing cry, and every wolf within a mile lifted its head. They named her Isolde, after Rowan's sister, with Kaysen as her second name, because Mira would not have it otherwise, and Rowan would not have allowed it any other way. Tammy, when he was finally permitted into the room, climbed onto the bed and laid his silver muzzle along the baby's bare foot, and made a small churring sound in his throat, and the baby, 3 minutes old, kicked him gently in the nose. He sneezed. He looked deeply offended. Everyone in the room laughed, even Mira, who had not thought she had any laughter left in her after the last 12 hours. Rowan, sitting on the edge of the pallet with his arm around Mira's shoulders and his free hand cupped over the soft black down on his daughter's head, did not laugh. He was crying again, very quietly, in the way he had cried the night the fox kit had brought him a vole. Mira reached up and brushed her thumb along the unscarred corner of his mouth. "Stop," she said gently. "You'll set me off." He turned his face into her palm. He pressed his lips to her wrist. He said, against her skin, "Marry me, Mira of Hollowmere." She had been waiting for him to say it for weeks. She had not known she had been waiting until he did. She said yes. They were bonded under the great oak at the edge of the way station clearing, on the night of the spring equinox, with the pup Isolde in a sling against Mira's chest, and Tammy, who had begun in slow, patient stages to take his boy shape again for hours at a time, and who was now a solemn, dark-haired child of 4, with silver-gray eyes and a perpetual smudge of something on his chin, standing as their witness alongside Bray and a delegation of elders from Hollowmere, who had at last, with much grumbling and a formal apology that had taken 3 drafts, lifted Mira's exile. Rowan set his teeth at the curve of her shoulder and broke the skin in the small, precise mating bite, and the wire under Mira's ribs that had hummed and sung and burned and quieted, now bloomed, full and golden, into a steady warm cord that ran between them. She felt his joy in it. She felt his grief at the edges, the long backlog of his losses, the names of his dead. She gave him hers in return. Kaysen, and her mother, and her grandmother, and the small unborn brother who had not lived to see his first winter. They held each other's losses for a long moment in the new bond, and then, by mutual silent agreement, they set them down. The cord remained. It was warm. The morning after, Mira woke before the sun, in the wider, sturdier room that the Hollowmere youngsters had built onto the way station through the winter. Rowan was still asleep beside her, one heavy arm across her waist, his face slack and unguarded in a way she only ever saw when he slept. Isolde was in the cradle Bray had carved, breathing the soft, regular breath of a healthy infant. Tammy, in his boy shape, was curled at the foot of the bed with one small hand fisted in the quilt. Outside, somewhere in the bracken, a fox barked. Mira slid out from under Rowan's arm, careful not to wake him, and she went to the door and lifted the bar and stepped barefoot onto the flagstone where, 8 months ago, she had stood with her hands open and faced down a pearl-gray banner. The flagstone was cold. The grass beyond it was silver with dew. The sky to the east was just beginning to go pink. She stood for a moment with her hand on her belly, which was empty now of anything but herself, and she thought about the woman who had walked into the iron market of Thornhold on her last copper, and she thought, you didn't know. You didn't know any of it. And then she heard a small barefoot patter behind her, and a small warm hand slipped into hers, and Tammy, sleep-rumpled and serious, leaned against her hip and said, looking out at the pink east with her, "Is it morning?" "It is," she said. "Good," he said. "I am hungry." She laughed. She bent, easily now, with her body her own again, and she scooped him up and settled him on her hip, and she carried him back into the warm den where her king and her daughter slept, and she shut the door behind them. If you have made it this far with me, dear listener, I would love to know what you thought. Rate this story for me from 1 to 10 in the comments below, and tell me which moment caught you hardest. The auction? The fox kit at the door? The silver fire? Or the small voice asking, "Hungry? Please." If you want more stories like this one, full of fated bonds and slow-burn kings, and the women who refuse to let the world have the last word, hit that subscribe button and stay with me. There are a great many more nights like Mira's where this came from, and I would be honored to tell them to you. Until then, keep your fire banked, keep your door barred, and keep an eye on the threshold. You never know what the wood might bring you.